Okay, I think we are live everywhere now. So, hello everybody. I am HP Holo. I write books, and very often I also interview other people who write books. And today I am here with Tim Akers, who has recently released, well, one brand new book and then one mass market book. So, Tim, I will let you introduce yourself. Have at it.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Tim Akers. I am a writer primarily of fantasy and science fiction. The book that is just now out is Wraithbound, which is this, and has a lovely cover and is epic fantasy, traditional epic fantasy, high fantasy, hard magic is the short pitch. And then book two in the Night Watch series just came out in mass market. That is Men in Black at the Renaissance Fair. Um, the Night Watch series is a little unusual for me because it's much lighter. It's Terry Pratchett crossed with Jim Butcher kind of stuff. Um, Most of what I write is sort of high concepts, darker fantasy. So that's me.
Nice. All right. And for those who are really into dark fantasy, we are actually going to be giving away a signed copy of Wraithbound. And if you look in the event description, if you're on YouTube and Facebook, you will see a link you can click where you can input all the information. If you're on Twitter, Twitter doesn't connect with my streaming software very well. So if you want to enter, you just have to find YouTube or Facebook. But we're going to be streaming on the Bane pages. So I'm also going to put the link in the chat right now. So, oops, that is the wrong link. I will find it and then put it back on there when you guys are when you're chatting about something else. But so yeah, so I've done my contest information, and now my thing is giving me all sorts of notifications. What's going on? Okay, all right. I don't know what my thing's doing. Anyway, so I have started reading Wraithbound, and I am like 30 pages in, but I already love it. And earlier you did describe it as a high fantasy, hard magic kind of book, and that's already obvious within the first 30 pages. And I really, really love what I've seen of the magic system thus far. And so I'm really curious. Tell me more about it. Like, how did you come up with this specific magic system?
Sure. Okay. So Wraithbound is my ninth book. So there's some history here of me coming up with strange things. But I had a trilogy prior to this called the Hallowed War trilogy, which was high concepts, like large cast, kind of retelling of the North and the South of England integrating a long time ago. And it was a huge cast. And when I finished that series, I told myself that I was not going to write that many people in one book ever again. Now, that was a lie. I've already started doing it. But um, so I was like, all right, I'm going to write a single POV, but he needs someone to be snarky with. So I'll have him have a ghost stitched into his soul. That just seems like a easy way to solve that problem. Always have someone to talk to, and it sounds like an interesting idea. So I sat down and began working on the magic system that would allow that. That's kind of how most of my ideas start. I come up with an idea that I think is cool, and then I sort of step back and say, "All right, how am I going to make this make sense?" So the magic system is called spirit binding, and the basic idea is there are 8 planes of reality, the 4 elemental planes that we're all familiar with in traditional Western thought: earth, fire, air, and wind. And then I also have 4 other planes, which are order, chaos, life, and death. And uh, all of those planes have native denizens. The elementals are the obvious, zephyrs for air elementals, um, and so forth. But then there's also, for order and chaos, they get called angels and demons. It's a little bit of a tricky description, but they're basically spirits of order and spirits of chaos. And then life and death are the fae, are all the life spirits, and wraiths are all of the death spirits. And the way that you do magic is you fray the edge of your soul, and then you bind a spirit from one of these other planes into it, into your soul. And that lets you either draw the spirit into the material plane and do cool stuff, or you can use it kind of as an anchor to draw yourself um, into the appropriate plane. So you can visit the spirit of the land of the dead, or you can visit the sort of primal life realm, or similar things. Uh, so there are a lot of implications to that, because you can bind more than one sort of spirit, and there are spirits of different like ranks. Essentially, I'm obviously a gamer, so I think of these things in terms of like, how would this work out in a role playing game before I come up with a plot. So
That
that's
actually touches on one of my later questions. I was going to ask you how
yeah,
how gaming affects your writing.
yeah. There's a lot to it, but that's the core magic system. So then I come with the cosmology first, and then I begin to look at how that cosmology's history would have worked out. Like, how did this come to be? And then I began working on history and culture and the things that make up the world, and then I began finding plot within that. So
Cool. So you pretty much start with magic system first, and then everything comes from that.
I start with cosmology first,
Okay.
and magic is always sort of an integral part of that. Like, my
Mhm.
second question is always, okay, now how do I do airships in this world? Because I'm kind of an
Yes.
airships guy.
Oh, I
Uh,
love airships. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
love. Yeah, they're core to everything I've ever done. So how do airships? How do I do flying? How do I do
Mhm.
how does military stuff work? How does religion work within this context? And just kind of roll from there. So
Is that true for all of your books, or was that a unique creation process for this one? Like you
um,
start with cosmology and whatnot for all of them?
that's usually how I do my
Mhm.
world building. That's usually the first thing that makes me interested in about a book is what the world looks like, and the cosmology. Like the earlier stuff, the steampunk stuff, cosmology was definitely part of it.
Mhm.
Um, and then for the Pagan Knight, the Hallowed War series, that I pitched that book as I'm doing with religion what Brandon Sanderson does with magic. I
Ooh.
did a very thorough tear down of this kind of combination between Shintoism and Mesoamerican
Mhm.
duality, and then filtered it through medieval Catholicism and paganism,
Ooh.
and created a world based on that, and then did the cultural stuff after that. So yeah, it's definitely part of all of everything that I do.
That's cool. All right, I'm actually going to go straight into my gaming question. Now, I see you posting miniature wargaming, like miniatures that you've painted and stuff all the time. And so you're obviously very much into gaming. How does gaming affect your writing?
I always want to consider there are two kinds of gaming that I do, right? I do role playing games, D&D and similar, and I do war gaming. And so if there's going to be large scale military conflicts uh, in a book or in a story, uh, I I consider it from both historical backgrounds, like what would an actual medieval battle look like, and then how magic and the particular strangeness of this world, how that's going to change um, those considerations. So, for example, again, the Hallowed War trilogy, um, there's a lot of big military medieval battles, George Martin style, massive combat. And my main game is an offshoot of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, right? So a game called Kings of War, and it's very much ranks and flanks kind of combat. And so if you read a book of mine, especially like the Hallowed War trilogy, you get to the combat, it's going to be fairly medieval accurate. You kind of make some changes to make things more exciting and interesting, but yeah, it's definitely part of the background. Um, the other side of things, the tabletop role playing games and stuff. Um, I don't I don't go as far as like lit RPG writers do with the systems, but I very heavily consider, like, if I was going to make a game in this world, what what would it look like? What would the classes be? How would all of that kind of stuff function? Plus, like, my understanding of world building really comes from game design. Like, I've been doing game design stuff longer than I've been writing novels. my first bylines back in the 90s were with game companies. And so just I create a world in a way that game designers create worlds, which is you think about cultures and you think about guilds and you think about how the characters are going to integrate into that in an interesting and unusual way. And also, like, when you consider tension in a world, it's usually a little more simple than the real world because the real world is incredibly complicated. But you want clear narrative drive that derives from cultural pressure. So if you drop characters into a game city, they need to be able to figure things out pretty quickly as far as like who's in charge, who's where the tensions are, all that kind of stuff. And the reader needs to have the same kind of ability to approach that. So I have this idea where there are always three opposing powers, and where they intersect, that sort of triangle of intersection, is where the story is. Um, and so that's how I handle. If I'm building a city for a game, I have the church, the government, and I don't know, the mercantiles guild, and those things kind of um, compete with one another in a clear way that makes it easy for the players to look around and be like, oh, these guys want this and these guys want that, and so I'll get involved with it that way. Um, so it's sort of part of the world building process. I will say there's another series that I'm working on that's probably a book or two down the line, and I made the card game for it first, card/war game for it first, and then began building the world because I had this idea about, like, here's a really cool magic system, how's that going to work, and I want it to be a game, obviously, and so I'm working on that first, and then I began building the world around it.
That's super cool. Now, just to clarify, did you work professionally in game design?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
My
okay, awesome.
my very first byline was for White Wolf Game Studios. I worked for Mayfair, and then a bunch of smaller companies that are out of business back in the 90s. And then I quit for a while because I had a job, uh, and I changed my focus to novel writing and did that just straight for a decade or so.
Mhm.
And then I realized I needed to get back. I wanted to get back into the gaming part of stuff professionally, and started looking for gigs. And I've done work for Kobold Press. They do Midgard, and
Mhm.
did a little bit of work for Paizo, but really very little. It's a very hard gig to get, and it's a harder gig to keep because the turnover at the line developer stage is very high. And so you
Ah,
get somebody that likes your work, that's great, but they're gone a year later. And so then you've got to reintroduce yourself to the next person. And they always bring in people that they like also. So
right.
from a freelance perspective, it's really tough. Um, and then I got hooked up with a company called Weird Games out of Atlanta. They do a game called Malifaux, which is Victorian horror. It's a
Ooh.
The models in it are really cool. The world is really cool, and the game itself is a lot of fun. And it's a unique system because it's a tabletop, like, war game, which is usually handled by dice. But
Mhm.
all of the combat resolution is done with cards, with a regular, you know, deck of
Ah,
cards,
cool.
but you have a hand and you're flipping cards, and it's a unique system, and it's really a lot different because you have a
Mhm.
lot more control over what happens, kind of, than you know than most, like, just rolling dice kind of games. So it's a great game, and I do a lot of writing for that now. I've been doing that for 4 or 5 years maybe, and that's been a good gig. So
Cool. All right, we actually have a few viewer questions. So, both from Chance, actually. Hi, Chance. First one is, ever looked at any of the RPG tabletop games being raised on Kickstarter? He's seen a few that are amazing, from art to rules used to make them, compared to more major series. Do you have much experience with Kickstarter games? Because Kickstarter in
I have
itself.
very little experience. Yeah, I have very little experience directly with Kickstarter. There is a game that I have NDAs on that I can't talk about, but
Ah,
that I know is coming to Kickstarter this summer,
mhm,
um, and is kind of a big game. So I'm looking forward to that. They just hired me to do the world building for it. Um, so when that comes out, I will suddenly have a lot of experience with Kickstarter. But as of right now, I know nothing about it. just that it's a way to make money.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I have been looking into Kickstarter for publishing purposes, especially since it has more started taking the publishing world, especially the indie publishing world, more by storm ever since Brandon Sanderson did his
Yep.
miraculous Kickstarter. But
Yep.
yeah, it's something that I'm too busy writing to look into it right now.
Yeah, that's really my problem with all of these
Yeah.
things is I have spent my life getting good at writing books and
Mhm.
games, and there's all this other stuff, and I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
know,
That's
outside of
that
my
is
skill
one of
set.
the most like, when you're a career writer, that's one of the most challenging things about being a writer because obviously you have to write, but then there's so many other things that it's recommended that you do for marketing purposes, and at a certain point, it becomes really challenging to figure out, like, where where do I focus? Like, what's the most efficient way to get stuff done and also be able to write books on a decent schedule?
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
it's
and it's really a matter of like developing discipline not only in the writing but also in like, okay, got to go do an hour of marketing now,
yeah.
and that's tough. I'm like, I'm a hermit, you know, and it's not easy to sort of get out there and do that stuff, but you learn, you figure it out.
Oh
It's
yeah.
part of the job.
Speaking of writing processes, do you have a excuse me, specific writing ritual that you follow, or is it just chaos, write whenever you get a chance kind of stuff?
So I don't. When I had a full time job, a while back in the day, and back then it was very much a matter of being like, all right, I need to take an hour a night and carve out that time just to write. Um, and on the weekends, I'd take an hour or two on Saturday to try to make sure that I'm getting words down. Now that I write full time, I am much looser about my schedule, but I still try to be somewhat disciplined with it. My wife and I are both self-employed, and so we make a big deal about not being beholden to clocks, even though there's a lovely giant Victorian clock there in the background. Like, I don't set an alarm clock. I get up when I get up, and I get down here when I get down here. But um, yeah, I still develop habits around it. Now, where it gets tricky is if you begin to develop like a ritual, and you begin to think of it like, oh, my muse won't work unless I'm doing it at this time or in this way, or, I've got my special coffee or my tea or whatever, that provide you with a lot of excuses to not write. And really, you just need to like get your butt in your chair and work. Um, so I, I'm not I'm not super like, I've got to do it this way. I just try to get a couple of hours in the morning, a couple hours in the afternoon. But like, if I have to do some house cleaning or if I need to run some errands, I miss those things, and those hours. That's okay. It's all part of the job. Unknown Armies was one of my favorite stories to write for. Greg Stolze is a friend of mine, and I didn't meet him um, until after I wrote for the story, wrote for the game. Didn't even know he was local to me, and we met at a writing thing somewhere. And yeah, I love UA. And it's funny because that is a game that is very heavily influenced by one of my favorite authors, a guy named Tim Powers, and I had never read Tim Powers prior to that. And it appeared in the recommended reading for the UA manual, and I went back and read Last Call and was like, oh, this guy's a genius. I should probably read everything he's ever written quickly.
I have heard exactly the same thing about Tim Powers from several other authors, and so he is moving up my list once
And
I
he's now
finish
a
all
Bain
my
author. So
homework reading.
start with Last Call. That's, I think, I mean, personally, I think that's his best book. But I mean, a lot of people like, what was it, the Red Sails or something? I can't remember
Hmm. That one sounds familiar too. But I have another question from Chance, actually, which is any movie or TV deals for your books yet?
No, and I don't like. I mean, I write cinematically, and if that happens, great. But I write books because I want to write books. Like, I know how to write a screenplay. I've never tried to push into the Hollywood arena personally. Um, like, if somebody decides they want to do that, that'd be cool. I'm not going to say no. I'll take that money. But I've never never had that opportunity. No, it's life.
Sorry, just realized we're 20 minutes in and we've only somewhat talked about the book. So I want to hear about the characters in Wraithbound. Who was your favorite to write? And also, who was the most challenging to write?
Um, this is going to sound weird, but I'm an only child and I'm an introvert. And so when I write uh, close knit families that have great rapport, I grew up in a very small town, uh, that have great rapport and that, get along well with their parents, and the brother and sister relationship is positive, and they've got friends outside. That's all. That is me writing the other. So when
Mhm.
most people talk about writing the other, they mean like writing different genders or something. For me, it's close knit family that gets along. That's a weird world for me. So writing familial relationships is always not difficult for me, but it's always something that
Mhm.
I have to apply myself to.
Mhm.
Um, the character I liked writing the best was Karis, the lawbinder. You probably haven't met her yet.
Yeah, I don't think so, but not this early in where I am.
Yeah, she is. She appears later on, and she's a justicar, and her soul is bound to an angel, and she's very much like hotshot law guy. Um, she's kind of like from Simon Pegg's character from Hot Fuzz.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, sort of like that, but magic. So yeah, she was a lot of fun. She's a good time. I want to write some novellas with her, just kind of as an outside project when
Mhm.
I have some free time. Just
I need at
lying
least some free
around.
time. How many now, is this planned to be a series?
Yeah, yeah. I have 3 books planned in Wraithbound specifically. I have 20 books in like the expanded universe, but
Ooh.
how much of that is going to actually come out? Bane's only going to publish a book a year. I've got Night
Mhm.
Watch stuff to do.
Yeah.
So some of that I might do myself. It really depends on kind of reception and what my schedule allows, really.
Cool.
But yeah, it's going to be a 3 book series. Um, I'm writing book 3 of the Night Watch series right now. Once that's done, I'm going to write books 2 and 3 of Wraithbound sequentially. Just write them all at once
Mhm.
and have that done, and then switch to Bladecaster and go from there.
Cool. And I want to speak a bit about the Night Watch series too, since Valhellions came out in mass market. Now, it is quite different from Wraithbound in that it's more. I wouldn't call it a comedy series, but it's definitely more comedic than Wraithbound. And you said earlier that you tend to lean toward writing. Generally, you tend to lean toward writing darker, harder fantasy. So why the sudden change with the Night Watch series?
So let's see. When I finish the Hallowed War trilogy, my agent is Joshua Bilmuth, same agent as Brandon Sanderson, and he came to me and said, "All right, we need to discuss what your next thing is going to be." Um, in the past, I've always just kind of written what I feel like, and we wanted to be a little more intentional this time. So I produced a pitch sheet of like 8 ideas, I think, that I had, and about a paragraph on each of them. And he passed that around the agency and sort of reviewed it himself. And he came back with 3 suggestions. Um, and of those suggestions, I chose Wraithbound, which was already sort of the direction I was headed anyway. I already had an outline for that, and it was the one I was the most excited about. So I was glad that that's the one he picked, um, or that one of the ones that he picked. So I began working on that, and I wrote probably half the book, maybe 3/4 of the book. And then I woke up one morning, and the world building idea for Night Watch just fell in my head. Uh, and really, the first third of the book occurred to me, and it was like 4 or 5 in the morning, and I just lay there in bed like this. I need to at least write this down so I don't forget it.
Those
Um,
are the best moments as a writer. Like
they are,
stressful because they come at weird hours, but when you have those strokes of inspiration, they are just
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, they're marvelous. Except when you're on deadline and contract, it gets difficult. So most of my books take about 8 months to write. That is my general schedule from first draft to something that I'm happy giving Joshua or giving my editor. Um, and I sat down and I wrote Night Watch in about 10 weeks. So for me, very fast. I'm a relatively slow writer. I care too much about individual word choice to be like, I can't do that.
Oh, I'm the same way. I
Yeah.
spend a like when I get to the editing phase of my stuff, I will spend like an hour picking out the right word if it's bothering me in a sentence. It is insane, but ugh.
Yeah. It's not good for your career, but it's, you write how you write. You can't help it.
Yep.
So I wrote Night Watch very quickly and went to Joshua and was like, here's a book. It's not the book we discussed, but here's a book. And he wasn't actually super thrilled about that because I mean he already had a list of people he wanted to send Wraithbounds to, and it's a different Night Watch is different enough that you want to pitch to different people. So we went through a couple rounds of edits on it and sent it out, and Bane bought it. But as far as like why it's so much different than Wraithbound, um, I don't know. Most people I know who have like a dark sense of humor are also really kind of funny people, and I
They're
am,
the best kind of funny people.
yeah, yeah, and I am by nature a funny guy. Now, like I'm not, stand up in front of a group of people and be funny kind,
Mhm.
but I've got a lot of humor in me. So that is because you'll see this bookcase behind me right there. That is my father's library of P.G. Wodehouse books. Um,
Ooh.
yeah, Jeeves and Wooster
Oh, I
is the
love Jeeves
biggest
and
one.
Wooster.
And that when other people's dads were reading them, I don't even know, Winnie the Pooh or something. He was reading me Wodehouse. So from a very young age, I've had this sort of odd British sense of humor. And so that kind of thing like occurs naturally to me, but I've never
Mhm.
really written it into my books. There are always moments of humor in there because you want to like, you can't be
Yeah,
just dark, 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 dark. You got to have
the
people
reader needs a
make
break
jokes.
every now and then,
Yeah,
even in a dark story.
yeah. People make jokes in their lives, no matter how
Mhm.
horrible it is. And so this is one where I'm leaning a little bit more into it. I think of it as comedy in the way that like Guardians of the Galaxy is comedy.
Mhm.
It's an adventure story that's got a bunch of jokes in it,
Right.
but it's not Douglas Adams funny. It's a
Mhm.
different kind of funny. So
I think the Terry Pratchett comparison earlier was spot on because I definitely get some Pratchett vibes from
funny
it.
story. I have never read Terry Pratchett.
What?
I know.
Oh my
No, I
gosh.
know. I'm aware. I have read Good Omens. That's the only Pratchett I've read because I was a gaming fan for a long time.
Mhm.
But no, I've never like I read
Oh,
Douglas
my
Adams and
God.
I've read other British humor, obviously, but Pratchett somehow I just missed. Like it just clean missed it, and I'm
That
scared
blows
to
my
start it
mind.
now.
I had another question, but it just fell right out of my brain. Dang it. Let's see. Well, while I try to remember my questions, we've actually had a little avalanche of questions from viewers. So, first one comes from Linda, who asks, "Have you used character maps?"
I am sure that is a specific technique for creating characters, and I'm not familiar with it. So
I'm not familiar
I'm
with
going to
it
say
either.
no. But
So, Linda, if you want to clarify,
yeah,
we can
I
answer. We're
I do a
completely.
lot of character development in the sense that I like, I do a lot of consideration of like inner wound and, um, what sort of what the dissonance is between the character's inner self and outer self, and how they fit into the world and how they don't fit into the world, and what they want and what is preventing them from having that. And so, like, I do a lot of character development stuff, but I don't know, a lot of that I think comes from RPGs again, as opposed to um, just straight writing. Like I technically have a degree in creative writing, but most of what I know about commercial writing comes from actually writing books. So it's, I've developed systems, but I've not, like, I don't have a formalized like an outline or a spreadsheet that I follow for characters. If that makes sense.
Are you the sort of writer where your characters write themselves, or do you put active thought into them and intentionally craft them? If that makes
I
sense.
create I do a little bit of intentional crafting. The seed of the character is intentionally crafted, and then I interview them. I write a chapter or two from their perspective and sort of give them a try at it. And usually I will learn about the character as I'm writing the character. And that creates a bunch of text and narrative that I end up just having to throw out at the end. Some of which I can save for the actual novel, but frequently, like I'll write short stories trying to find trying to find the character's voice and stuff. Um, and usually I just trunk those. Sometimes I keep them. Sometimes I uh, put them out in the world just to give my fans something to read while I'm working on novels because um, I'll crack out 15 to 20,000 words on something and then just throw it away. And that feels like a waste. So it's kind of nice to have something that readers can look through and anticipate, but it ends up being non-canonical. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's one of my favorite things about Patreon. I haven't actually done it on Patreon yet because I've been writing on such a tight schedule, but I love having a place where I can share things that eventually didn't make it into the final novels. And it's super handy. Another question for you from Dustin. Is there going to be an audiobook?
You're a Bane author, you know the problem here. So yes, but Bane has licensed out their audiobook rights for their entire catalog. And so somebody else does it. And there is not a lot of communication between that company and Bane and that company and the author. So, like, it would be great if the audiobook came out at the same time as the other book, as the print version. Or if I could tell you, yes, it'll be in 6 months. I don't know. The audio for Night Watch came out, I think, 6 months after the print version came out, but I didn't know it until I started. It started showing up in my book scan numbers. I'm like, oh look, I sold some audiobooks of Night Watch. Is that out? And I went and checked Amazon. I was like, oh yeah, it's out. Cool. I should probably tell somebody about that. Do an announcement or something.
Yeah, we often find out when Jacob's books are out in audio when readers tell us.
Yeah. Valhellions, the print version has been out for a year, still no audiobook. So it's a frustration with Bane authors specifically. So yeah, there will be an audiobook someday. If the print book sells well, then that will incentivize them to put out the audio. So
Go buy books, people. Buy them fast. Buy lots of them. Give them to your friends.
Yes.
We have another question from Chance, actually, which is when describing the feel of weapons, do you use your imagination or do you try to get a real version to see how it weighs and how it feels in your hand? Weapons are fun. I like these.
That is a good question. So I do some practical stuff, and I do have a history of some martial arts and some just Hema historical European martial arts stuff. I have never clomped around in armor. I've clomped around in fake armor, which is not really the same. When I was in college, I did a lot more of that, but that was a while ago. So I mostly have to use my imagination. I do study both medieval manuals of blade and also more modern practical examinations of how combat was done in a practical sense to understand that kind of thing. And I interview people who do Hema sparring. So yeah, it's a combination. Like I'm the kind of guy where like I want things to feel realistic, but I don't want realism to impose on the narrative. Like if I have a cool thing I want to have happen, and people are like, well, you can't do that with a Zweihander. Well, guess what? I can. because it's just words on a page, kid. So yeah, I do a little bit of both.
Do you have a favorite weapon that you like to write?
I'm a swords guy.
I love
Like
swords.
I like swords of all.
There's just
Of all.
something really cool about a sword,
Yeah,
just in and of itself.
yeah. It's visually exciting. There's such variety of swords
Mhm.
that you can describe, and they're just dramatic and stuff. So yeah,
There's
a lot
just
of
a
fun.
certain sort of fantasy romance to
Yeah,
swords too. I remember when I was reading, and I want to say it was the prologue of Wraithbound. I remember reading your description of the main character's father and him forming his spirit blade, and just the way you described it, just it reminded me of when I was a kid, and I would imagine, my little magical swords, and it just made me want to run around my yard and just swing this fake sword. I
look,
just
finding a
it
good
was
stick is the best part of being a kid.
oh yeah.
Um, I So the series that I'm writing after this, which is tentatively called Bladecaster, the pitch for it was, would it be cool if mages would duel, but instead of wands, their their magic item is a sword that they
Oh
have
heck
to
yes.
move in a certain way in order to cast spells, so that you can counter both with magic, but also by riposting, and that changes the nature of the spell. And then you have to do a different kata and stuff. So it was originally called Sword Mage, which is the dumb name, but it really describes accurately what we're doing. So that's the one that I did the card game for first, where I'm like, all right, dueling mages, but swords go. And that's the one that's what's next. I'm excited about it.
I'm gonna read that one just for the magic system alone. I love it.
That's the goal.
All right. I actually remembered my question from like 20 minutes ago.
Excellent.
There was a point where I think I was posting pictures of quotes from Night Watch, and I posted the first line, and it's a great first couple of lines. But I remember you commenting back that the first line is one of the things that you put the most thought into. You always want to make sure you have a really, really stellar first line. And I was curious, what's your technique for determining what your stellar must have first line is?
Um, I struggle with technique. I honestly think that's just art. Um, I talk about writing as being a craft,
Mhm.
and there's a lot about writing that you can figure out how to do by studying good books and talking to other writers and thinking about plotting structure and doing outline and stuff. But at a certain level, there are elements of writing that's just art that you can't talk about technique quite as easily. Um, and like first lines are a thing I kind of have a gift for.
I agree.
Yeah, there's and like that was my first skill. Like I got into writing because I knew naturally how to write a good sentence.
Mhm.
And that came probably from writing, from a lot of reading when I was a kid. Uh,
Especially reading PG Woodhouse.
yeah, Wodehouse is good at it.
Language is just
Tolkien
fantastic.
is good at it. A lot of British authors are really great at it. William Gibson was like
Mhm.
um, a real change in my life, because before that I mean I love these books still, but I was reading a lot of Bolo and Fred Saberhagen Book of Swords, and um, oh, what's the other one? Berserker. Like those were like my three: Bolo, Berserker, and Book of Swords. And then I read Gibson, and that fundamentally changed the way I thought about language, literally. Um, and to such an extent that like it took a decade of writing before it wasn't obvious that I was just trying to parrot William Gibson, before I could develop really my own voice, my own style. And so like the language of art is one of those things that I have a talent for, that some artists, have. I think that if you try to write a really cool sentence too hard, that comes through. The reader, the writer is like desperately listening to. It's just too obvious that the writer is like, pay attention, pay attention. Uh, but if it's done calmly and easily, then it works out pretty well. And like Night Watch's first line is really good. I don't think I've written a first line that good again before that or again. And I'm not sure I'll be able to, because it's just it so thoroughly encapsulates the spirit of the book
It
that
really, really does. It's just such an efficient piece
whenever
of
I'm at a
writing.
convention and trying to pitch the book to people, and like it's Men in Black at the Renaissance Fair, tell you what, read the first paragraph. If you like that,
Yeah.
you'll like the book.
Men
Uh,
in Black at the Ren Fair is one of the single best taglines I've ever seen, too. Like, I remember picking up Night Watch solely after reading that. I didn't even read the blurb on the back of the book. I just saw Men in Black at the Ren Fair and was like, yes, it's got a dragon on the cover. It's got that blurb or got that tagline. We're going
yeah.
for it. And,
That's the other thing I'm good at is pitches.
uh-huh.
I sold my first book on pitch. Um, just three chapters and a synopsis and a pitch. Um, and I don't know, like that efficiency of language is something that I've practiced a lot, because you need to be able to do that,
Hmm.
um, when you're trying to sell to trad publishers,
Oh, yeah.
uh, and being able to very efficiently do an elevator pitch, is it's part of the job. It's part of the game.
That's one of the biggest pieces of advice I give to starting writers at cons, because whenever you're at a con table, people there's always the people who come up and say, hey, I'm writing a book, or I finished a book and I'm publishing my first book or something like that, and I'll ask them what it's about, and they'll start going into this minutes long description, and I always want to stop them and
Stop.
be like, this is cool, but readers are not going to listen that long. You need to have like 5 words that you can sum this up in.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said for that kind of efficiency, because when you think about it, like there is no end to the type of entertainment we have available, and you basically have to take that in mind. You're competing with every other kind of distraction your reader could be engaging in, and you have to be quick about it.
Oh, there
Um,
there are a lot of things that like new writers think are the enemy. Oh,
mhm,
other writers or all this other stuff. But the enemy is obscurity. Like the enemy
mhm,
is the sheer deluge of not just books. I mean, books alone. There are hundreds and hundreds of books coming out daily.
mhm.
In your genre. And getting above the fray of those is difficult. So,
Oh
but
yeah.
beyond that, video games and gaming and just napping, doom scrolling. There are all these things that you could be doing that aren't books, that you need to get over and get past. So,
Yep. Okay, we've got a clarification from Linda on the character question, and she says she's referring to like a biography book of your characters to allow consistency within the series, kind of like a series Bible.
yeah, a Bible. Yeah. Yes, I do that. And I keep it in a spreadsheet, and part of it is, um, I have a description of the character. I have some notes about their motivations, and I have necessary relational stuff. So and so is the sister of so and so. They got into a fight with this other person at this point. Are they alive? Are they dead? Were they wounded? That kind of um, consistent sort of, to make sure that like their shoes are the same color in every scene, sort of thing. Yeah, I have that, absolutely.
Cool. I use something similar. I have there was a note I was reading in one of my books a while back where I made a note to myself, like, make sure this character has the right number of eyes, because at some point in the course of editing I gave her an eye patch. And in some
Make sure it's
scenes
the right
she
eye.
had both eyes, and in other scenes she did not. And so, okay, got a relevant question from Zeckler here. Hi, Zeckler. I've got a whole crowd of my people in here. I'm showing up late. My question is, what's your elevator pitch for Wraithbound? Because we just went over the elevator pitch for the Night Watch series, and
So the elevator pitch for Wraithbound is, it is a high fantasy, hard magic, post-apocalyptic flintlock fantasy. The war between order and chaos has ended, and the bad guys have won, and the world is very slowly falling apart. And the main character is trying to become a mage. Uh, they try to bind a storm spirit to their soul, and inadvertently bind the the wraith of a murdered mage instead, and that causes shenanigans. Their world falls apart quite literally after that. So that's the pitch.
I love the stakes in this series, like the whole world literally falling apart.
Or it
Is
has fallen apart.
yeah,
Like
or well, it has fallen apart, it's continually falling apart. Yeah. Let's see here. We are down to the last 15 minutes. So I want to reiterate to everyone too, we do have the contest running on, where you can enter to win a signed copy of Wraithbound, and I'm going to share that link again for ease of access. Let me find it again, and boop, there it is. I wanted to ask a question. Like, world building is obviously your thing, and a lot of people who write fantasy, like that's one of the reasons, one of the things that gets them into writing fantasy in the first place. But from personal experience, world building can get overwhelming very easily. And so my question is, what do you do to sort of keep your world under control as you're writing it? I guess another way to ask that question would be, how do you keep your world from sprawling out of control as you write?
uh, well, I mean, the background I'm sure is out of control, but the reader never has to see that. You only need to show the parts that are relevant to the plot and to the narrative. The temptation is always to be like, oh, I've got all these really cool things, this cool stuff. Here, look at all my cool stuff, and the reader doesn't need to know that stuff necessarily. You really only need to show the bare minimum things for the reader to understand the story and to be able to move forward. Now, like in Wraithbound, the magic system is a core element of that process. And when I plot, I do bracketing, which is to say, um, I come up with a bunch of subplots, including the main plot, and I say, okay, what is the core plot question for this particular subplot? And I come up with what the answer is. And then I decide what all the steps are between those two. And then when I'm writing, I will take one or two steps from different subplots and combine them into a single scene, if that makes sense. So um, it's really a matter of, like, you know doing it in a layered, calm fashion. I like to do all of my character development and my world building uh, in interaction. Um, I don't want to I hate lore dump. I hate, story dumps. Um, Too much exposition is always a problem for me in reading. So I really want uh, the 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 world building to follow the narrative, so that I don't show the magic system by sitting the characters down and having them explain the magic system to each other. I just put the magic system in the world in action and describe it as it goes along. Uh, and that's the thing that Sanderson's pretty good at. But honestly, he's kind of gotten out of control. Like, I'm reading Stormlight Archive book 5 right now, and huge chunks of that book are just people explaining things to each other. It drives me nuts. So much of it could be just handled through interaction and character action and plot. So Wraithbound, I haven't finished yet, but that is a book where I feel like I'm peeling an onion from the inside out, and you very slowly reveal stuff and put it in front of the character or the reader, and just have things be discovered as it becomes relevant
Mhm.
to the plot. Like, in the world building, there's a whole reason why the center of the world is called Fulcrum, and it's on a dead tree the size of the sky. But
I know, I'm intrigued by this. Like, my
yeah,
30 pages in, I keep seeing references to it, and I'm like, I need to know what this is.
it does not appear in book one physically. It's just reference,
Mhm.
but it is a core element of the world building and a core element of both the trilogy and the expanded universe. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you in the book, like, here's why it's like that.
Yeah.
It's all part of, that will be revealed in time. You just kind of have to trust the author at a certain level.
Hmm. Cool. Well, let's see here. I had another question, and naturally it fell right out of my brain again. While I'm trying to remember my question, one thing I did want to say for our audience is that anyone who follows DragonCon knows that the Dragon Award nomination period just opened, and if I recall correctly, WRAITHBOUND is eligible for nomination, right? Is Valhellions, or did that come out?
Valhellions is not.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Just WraithBound is. I have to admit, I don't like the way that DragonCon does their eligibility period.
Oh, really?
Because it's just a matter like, okay, it closes what, July 29th or something? And
I've actually got it pulled up. Let me see.
Yeah. And
Let me
books
see.
that can be, the period is July 1st of 2022 to June of June 2023. 2022, 2023, right?
Yes.
And then it closes July 29th, the end of July of
19th is when the nomination period ends.
19th. That's even worse, because there are books that come out at the end of June 2023 that have to get enough traction,
Yep.
theoretically, to be nominated in that period. Whereas there are other books that came out, a long time ago that have plenty of time to gain traction.
Yeah.
I mean, most of us don't, have a book come out and have it be a bestseller the next day. There's a long tail of attention and promotion. And it takes 6 months, a year to like actually fully expose the book to the audience.
Yep. It almost seems like there needs to be some kind of little, I don't know what they would do to give wiggle room, but there needs to be some kind of little wiggle room for those novels that release in that weird little period.
Well, the way the Hugos do it is you're voting in 2023 for books that came out in 22.
Okay, yeah.
You begin the nomination process, I think, at the beginning of the summer, and the actual voting is at the end of August. Now, there are a lot of problems with the Hugos. The fact that there is a minimum of 6 months between the last book that is eligible releasing and the voting even opening is, I think, a good system. So anyway, yes, the point is, WraithBound is up, and I think it would be great if it got nominated. I also like the cover a lot.
It has a great cover, and this year there's also a best illustrative cover category.
Really?
And so so that's I think that's an absolutely cool thing, because there's so much good art on sci-fi and fantasy covers, and it's nice to see it getting acknowledged. But for those who are not familiar with the Dragon Awards, the awards are given based entirely upon votes by fans. So you don't necessarily have to be a member of a special organization. You don't even have to have a membership to DragonCon to vote. And so, yeah, but I'm going to post the link to the Dragon Award nomination page. Nominate your favorite authors for things. We love nominations. So let's see. We have another question. From Richard Stevens. Are there plans for an audio version? Richard, I think you came in late. That was actually answered earlier. The short version is yes, but schedules are chaotic, so we don't know a release date. And so let me type this in first. Dragon Award nomination form. And boop, there we go. And that actually puts us pretty close to finishing time. So Tim, thank you for coming on. This was a whole lot of fun. And I'll have you say again who you are, where people can find your stuff, and any other cool book news that you have.
I'm Tim Akers, and my books are at your local Barnes & Noble, on Amazon, on Bain.com. You can find me at timakers.net. I'm on Twitter and Facebook, pretty easy to find, fairly accessible human being. First book of the new series, WraithBound, out now. Night Watch is out, Valhellions is out.
Yep.
If you like sort of dark steampunk, Heart of Eridon is available online. So,
All right. Well, thank you again for joining me, and thank you everyone for watching. We had a good crowd tonight and a lot of really good questions. But until next time, bye.
Bye.